I'm Tom Wall, the University Librarian. I'm convinced that this is the last day of winter, so I'm in a good mood. And this room, I'll just have you know, has been used for several events, but it also, basically since the break, this room is one of the first places in the library that fills up with students. So in one way, I'm really pleased that we're able to do this with David's cooperation and using this room, and also with the ILA. We've done some events in here with Mary Crane. But I think the students are ready to get the room back, and we never schedule anything public in the libraries going up and leading to a study break or the study period and finals, because we actually bring in new seats. But this has been a wonderful room, and I hope it's been a good room for us with the different events that we've had and supporting David in the Dean's Colloquium. His last Dean's Colloquium, bittersweet sort of thing, but we're really pleased to have you as provost coming up starting in June 1st, right? So that's really great. But anyway, I just want to welcome you all here. We're thrilled to have events in the library, particularly if we can get students involved. There's a few students here. We love it if you have ideas about bringing students and faculty together. Talk to me, talk to the other deans if you have ideas. We are open to ways that we can bring faculty-student interaction into a neutral space, but one that's is built and designed for learning and student engagement. So that's about all I have to say, except to welcome David, my friend and colleague, and soon to be my new boss. So, David.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to see how this space has really come alive. This used to be the reserve room for those of you who remember, and to see this and the other spaces in the university libraries, it's really a wonderful kind of affirmation to see the extensive usage, the ways in which these spaces have come to life. I welcome all of you to the final Dean's Colloquium of the academic year, and I'll look forward to coming in the fall and attending future Dean's Colloquia here and whatever we might cook up over on the other side of Beacon Street. It's my great pleasure to introduce the man who's brought us all together this afternoon. Maxime Schreier, as many of you gathered here know, is professor of Russian, English, and Jewish studies here at Boston College, where he's taught since 1996. A graduate of Brown and Rutgers universities, he received his PhD from Yale in Russian literature. Professor Schreier has authored and edited over 10 books of criticism, biography, nonfiction, fiction, poetry, and translation. Among them, the critical studies The World of Nabokov's Stories and Russian Poet, Soviet Jew. He's the author of the literary memoir, Waiting for America, A Story of Emigration, and of the story collection, Yom Kippur in Amsterdam. Schreier won a 2007 National Jewish Book Award for his 2-volume Anthology of Jewish Russian Literature, and in 2012, he became the most recent Boston College faculty member to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship. Professor Schreier's most recent book, and the one we're going to hear some of this afternoon, is Leaving Russia, A Jewish Story, which was a finalist for the 2013 National Jewish Book Awards. Our colleague Jonathan Sarna over at Brandeis judged Leaving Russia, quote, an exquisite memoir, an unforgettable first-person account of Jewish life and Jewish suffering during the final years of Russian communism. Leaving Russia is a powerful memoir that brings recent history into conversation with today and with the rich literary and intellectual traditions that have shaped Professor Schreier's own writing. Just this week, Christopher Lydon over on Radio Open Source invited Professor Schreier to take part in a program focused on American readings and misreadings of Russian history and culture, down to just this past weekend. I very much look forward to learning a good deal more this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Maxime Schreier.
Good afternoon, and thank you, David, for this really warm introduction, which I very much appreciate as I do the opportunity to be part of this colloquium. And I want to thank Dean Quigley and Provost Quinn for their support over the years. And also I want to thank the office that David is leaving and the one he will soon be joining for all they have done to make sure that I'm able to work and complete this book because it was something that took a few years to complete. I also would like to thank all the people who worked on putting this event together. Ellis Lyons and Marjorie Ferry of the Office of the Dean, Dan Sawyer of Marketing Communication, and Roseanne Pellegrini of Public Affairs, and Chris Bergen of the bookstore. And although I may be standing far from you, I feel very close to you because you are my community, my colleagues and my audience, and it means a great deal for me to be standing before you here today and sharing some of these stories which began when I was a Jewish boy and which still continue today, although I'm not sure that I'm still a Jewish boy from Moscow, but a part of me still probably is that. And what I'd like to do is read a little bit from the prologue because it sets in motion some of the principal themes of the book and also suggests the method that I used in telling this story. And then I'm going to be very happy to answer some of your questions, and I'm told that there's going to be a reception, so I feel like I'm truly singing for our dinner, and so thank you for that as well. So this is from the prologue to Leaving Russia, a Jewish Story. We just got a call from the Office of Visas, said my mother's voice, and then it stopped, choking on the unpronounceable words. I can't. The black receiver of the street payphone felt cold and heavy in my hands. On my left, Moscow's midday traffic flowed down Leninsky Prospect, one side of it forging ahead to the city center, the other moving in the direction of the city's southwestern outskirts. On my right, a tall, wrought iron fence marked the western boundary of the Moscow University campus. Such ominous iron fences typically surrounded Soviet institutions, giving their workers, students, and patients the feeling of enclosure. Mama, what's wrong? They said they would be granting our request. My mother's voice laughed and sobbed into the heavy black receiver. I sometimes telephoned my mother when I was about to leave the campus. I had been a student there for 2.5 years, and unless it was bitterly cold outside, I liked calling from the street, the same payphone outside the high wrought iron fence before turning right toward the university metro station. Once, as a freshman, on a wager, I phoned my mother from a wood-paneled elevator going up to the top of the main university building, already past the 30th floor, and the clarity of sound was such that I wondered if instead of the bugged phone lines, some benevolent angeloids weren't carrying the signal in their cupped hands across the skies of the Soviet capital. On a sunny day, and the day in the middle of April when our family's emigration request was granted was a sunny and breezy day, one attained a great view from the environs from where I was standing. A great view of the environs from where I was standing. Behind my back, outside the campus perimeter, the tower of the main university building dominated and dwarfed the surroundings, a magisterial product of Stalin's architects, or simply an imperfect and distant echo of the Empire State Building. On the opposite side of Leninsky Prospect were the new Moscow Circus and the Children's Music Theater. As an impressionable Jewish preteen, how I relished the magic of Metterlinck's The Bluebird, a staple of this theater's repertoire. On stage, household objects, bread, fire, and water turned into otherworldly beings who could vanquish the quotidian. Beyond the buildings of the circus and the musical theater, the eye met grayish and brownish blocks of solid apartment buildings in what was one of Moscow's more desirable residential areas. My ride home took about an hour with 1 or 2 transfers, depending on the route I chose. During the morning, and especially the late afternoon rush hours, the train cars would be stuffed with people like sausages are stuffed with meat, fat, and fennel seeds. Overcrowded subway cars usually carried at least one colonel, in the colder months clad in a thick greatcoat and a tall Astrakhan with a cockade, or sometimes a general with a double red stripe running down his breeches. These were the coordinates of my Soviet youth: campus, bookstore, circus, and theater, Jewish luck, specter of the military service, brief escapes, and forbidding wrought iron fences. I pictured my mother as her voice broke out of the black receiver, punctuating the transience of our Soviet living. "Come home as soon as you can," Mother's voice said. "I'll catch a cab, Mamachka. I'll be there soon. Is Papa still at the clinic?" We would be leaving. At long last, after 9 years, I was thinking as I ran across Leninsky Prospect to the other side in violation of traffic regulations. I felt that the walls and fences which had stood in the way of my family's future were falling. In the spring of 1987, when the authorities finally granted our request to emigrate, my mother was turning 47, my father was 51. The Soviet imagination had dubbed us "отказники," from the Russian "отказ," refusal, meaning the ones who were denied or refused permission to leave the Soviet Union. In translation, the term "refusnik" had acquired an ambiguity whose irony was hardly intentioned. The Soviet authorities, not the Jews, were refusing, unless, of course, you consider the fact that we, the refuseniks, had refused the ticket to Soviet paradise. After turning onto Garden Ring, downtown Moscow's inner beltway, we got stuck in traffic and crawled for the next 15 minutes. The cabbie lit another one of his vile papyrosi. A cab ride from the campus to our apartment used to take half an hour to 40 minutes. Sitting on the back seat and ignoring the cabbie's attempts to chat me up about the prospects of the Central Army Club in the new soccer season. So, by the way, this was exactly 27 years ago, the beginning of April 1987. And, of course, the beginning of the soccer season was a huge deal in the Soviet Union, how it would be in some European countries or in Brazil, for instance. So this cabbie was really, in a way, very disengaged from the reality of Soviet existence. And so he's trying to chat me up about the new soccer season. I underwent one of the most intense experiences of remembering. It was as though I was sitting in a projection room with 2 screens and 2 films rolling simultaneously before my eyes. The 2 films divided the almost 20 years of my life in 2 halves. One of them visualized the first 11 years of my life, starting with my early childhood and bringing the action to the late fall of 1978. The other film unraveled in time from the then present, that April 1987 afternoon in Moscow, and my mother's agitated voice in the receiver, back to the events of 1978 that had changed the course of my family's history. The winter of 1978-79, when we had first applied for exit visas, divided the footage into before and after. A big part of me will always remain there in the projection room of my Soviet past, on the ripped vinyl back seat of a Moscow city cab taking me away from Russia. As I type these lines, Boston's capricious winter is coating the firs outside my window with the silkiest of snows. It's Monday morning. I've already driven my daughters to daycare, and my wife is at her clinic at Boston Medical Center taking care of patients, many of them immigrants like myself. I take a sip of my tepid Ceylon tea with lemon, then peer into the milky blue sky. A lot had changed since the spring of 1987. A lot has changed in me and in my parents and also in the country that held us captive. I was a different person back then, much more judgmental and intolerant. An inveterate tomcat playing at chivalry. I was thinner and looked lankier with a head of tall hair, which is obviously not here anymore, so I have to record it somehow. I hadn't read Lolita or seen Paris or Rio de Janeiro. Accustomed to expecting anti-Semitic behavior everywhere, I was ready to fight for my honor. I believed sincerely that Ronald Reagan was good just because he fiercely opposed the evil Soviet Empire. I'm going to skip a little section and read just a little bit more, which specifically talks about perhaps the deliberate double entendre in the book's title, Leaving Russia, a Jewish Story, which suggests on the one hand that this is a personal, private story, a autobiography and memoir both together of growing up Jewish in what used to be the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, it also suggests that in many ways the history of Jews in Russian lands and the Soviet Union was precisely one of leaving. Right, so Leaving Russia, a Jewish Story. Leaving Russia is a story of the life I left behind in 1987. The book takes its title from the knowledge that crystallized in me as I was writing it, from my birth in Moscow on the 5th of June, 1967, until my emigration on the 7th of June, 1987. My entire Russian and Soviet childhood and youth had been a protracted separation, a tearing away from my former homeland. Even before realizing it, around the age of 11 or 12, I had already been waiting to leave and unwittingly conducting research for this book. This book captures the first 20 years of my life in a way that suggests a loving ambition to alchemize the raw material of the collective, historical Soviet hours, months, and years into the timeline of an individual, private Jewish story. My final severing from Russia took place roughly over the course of my first decade in the United States and predated my marriage and the birth of my children, without the distance and perspective accorded by my immigrant years and by writing in a second language. I would not have been able to undertake this memoir. I'm 45 as I prepare these lines for publication. I've lived in America for over half of my life, no small affair for a Jewish boy from Moscow. The world I once knew, the way one knows the air, sky, grass, and trash of one's home, is gone forever. My family's emigration in 1987 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 have rendered me a stranger there, where I was born and grew up, gone from Russia and dispersed throughout the world as some of my oldest friends. Some of the kids I grew up with are no longer among the living, killed in Afghanistan and Chechnya, having drunk themselves to death, annihilated by the mob. While visiting Russia, I now feel there like a comprehending alien, still capable of appreciating many nuances of living there. I perceive today's Russia through a lens of foreignness, and this makes homecoming a surreal experience. I still feel a strong bond with the place and its people. What I don't feel when I visit Russia is a sense of belonging. But did I ever? Was my having been born a Jew in Russia God's mistake, as Sholem Aleichem Stevye, the dairyman, put it? In real life, such retrospective judgments do not usually help one deal with the baggage of memory. And then I go on relating a private anecdote, which has to do with the fact that when we left in early June 1987, my mother's late mother came with us, and she had another chapter in her life which lasted almost 25 years, and she lived till 95. But what is interesting is that her late husband, my late maternal grandfather, had been buried outside Moscow, and she always wanted to be buried in the same grave with him. Part of the family irony is that they had been divorced for 20 years and then got back together. And so, in other words, he died as her husband. She left as a widow, but there was a somewhat complicated past. And so, eventually, after her wishes, we had his remains reburied. And reburying any remains is complicated. It's doubly complicating when you're dealing with a Russian bureaucracy, and trebly complicated because of the Jewish laws on burial. But nevertheless, there are precedents. As you know, for instance, when Moses was taking the Jews out of Egypt, he did something very daring. He opened the crypt where Joseph's bones were laid to rest. And he opened it, he took the bones, and he said, we're taking the bones with us, meaning that we're leaving for good. And so I speak about that and the fact that they're now buried in the same grave at a Jewish cemetery in Rhode Island. But then I go on to sort of speculate about this sense of roots that we create as immigrants. Having no roots in America, we have created deep attachments by bringing here the remains of our ancestors. My grandmother, Anna Studnitz, who passed in November 2009, now rests with my grandfather after 22 Russian and 22 American years apart. Still, one cannot and perhaps should not seek to transplant all of one's roots. While visiting St. Petersburg, Leningrad, I used to go alone to the graves of my paternal grandparents and great-grandparents at the Preobrazhenskaya Jewish Cemetery and place pebbles on their granite headstones. Last year, so this was 2 years ago now, last year, my older daughter Mira, then a kindergartner, stood there with me as I choked on tears and tried to hide my face. A year later, in June of 2013, I took my younger daughter, Tatiana, to Russia, and together we stood at our ancestors' graves on the outskirts of St. Petersburg. This time, I did not hide the tears from my daughter. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm happy to take some questions if you have any. Please, Andrew.
Maxime, you have a couple of memoirs, and this memoir seems to deal with the period earlier than the second memoir. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you decided to tackle the order in which you were going to tell the story of your life and why you began later and went on earlier.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sofer. Thank you, Andrew. This is a great question. Well, what had really happened was that I wrote Waiting for America fairly quickly with a fairly deliberate sense of the kind of story that it was going to be. It was going to be a story about having emigrated but not yet having immigrated. And in that sense, I thought it was different from many immigrant stories because the immigrant stories tend to deal with how bad or perhaps good life was in the old country or with the challenges of the new immigrants. I wanted to focus on the sense that a 20-year-old protagonist from the Soviet Union, a former refusenik, a Jew feels having left the Soviet Union, feeling liberated and waiting for a transit, for a refugee visa to come to America, but in a way kind of feeling like his life is wide open because the sense of the future was very uncertain. And so in Waiting for America, one discovers the world after a lifetime of being kind of fenced in. It's a vibrant, romantic book. It's not a nostalgic book, and it's also not a book where the pain has to do with the separation. There are many challenges there, but they're challenges that one might perhaps encounter in something that's more like a novel than a memoir. But to make the long story short, I had finished the book as Karen, my wife, was expecting, when we were expecting the birth of Mira. I wanted to finish it. I wanted the book to be out, and I thought, well, there's a great way to provide for the heirs. They're going to make a movie out of it, but it hasn't yet happened. Although, no, there's been some interest. I'm still waiting. But my wife kept telling me as she was pregnant, she said, I'll tell you, this is what's going to happen. You're going to publish Waiting for America, and people are going to start asking, well, this is great, but why did you leave? What was it like growing up Jewish in the Soviet Union? You talk about refuseniks. Who were refuseniks? In other words, she kept telling me that it's inevitable that I'm going to have to address the questions of my origins and some pertinent aspects of, formative aspects of my upbringing. And so eventually, I also started thinking about my daughters who are bicultural and have a strong sense of Jewish Russianness, but also, of course, are very American, and how they would be interested in my past and their past. So eventually, I ended up writing a kind of unintended prequel, because, of course, prequel is a very unnatural way of thinking about things. One thinks more in sequels, I suppose, unless one is a super successful, writer or screenwriter, right? It became a prequel, although I really believe me when I say it, never thought that I would be going back so far and writing a whole story that is a kind of extended answer to the question that I could formulate as this. How is it that Jews from the former Soviet Union, from Russia, had such a strong sense of their roots, were so attached to the place, to its culture, had such a strong claim to the place's past and perhaps even present, and yet decided to uproot themselves en masse and to emigrate? And in some ways, the book became an extended answer to this question. So I thank you for that very interesting comment. Yeah. David.
I wonder if you could talk about language a little bit more, because I'm remembering one of my great memories of undergraduate life class with Joseph Koretsky, the Czech writer, and Joseph Brodsky, the Russian emigre, who were both reflecting on writing as emigres at that moment. And Brodsky, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was that his one true patriotism was to the Russian language, that his great love, that the belief for him was to that mother tongue somehow, and especially those writers who had influenced him. I wonder, I assume that in writing this you wrote it in English, that
Correct.
the process came out in English. I wonder what it was like to write about an experience that was entirely in Russian, those 67 to 87 years, with almost 30 years perspective through another language. How did that play out, and were there moments where there was a kind of desire to put it in Russian, or what was your relationship?
This is a fascinating question. I presume you heard the late Brodsky at Amherst, right? Strangely or not, just earlier today, I was telling my students, some of whom are here, about Joseph Brodsky, whose work they're reading in 20th century Russian literature. And today's class was in his early years, his trial of 1964, his exile, and then his emigration. And in fact, I was showing them the exit visa that he was issued in 1972, which says that he's leaving to live permanently in Israel, because that was really the only open route of emigration. So this is very apropos. And also, I remembered what he said in his Nobel address, and the rules of the acceptance of the Nobel Prize is such that the candidate must speak in his or her native language. So he spoke in Russian, but in the concluding part of the talk, he spoke of the fact that basically a poet, and I'm paraphrasing, is both a maker and a product of language. And just as a poet's exile is both a creation and a creator of language. He didn't even say that it's the Russian language, but the language per se. He also did say that a poet is someone who finds himself in a condition that's akin to that of an addict. In other words, it's a dependency on poetic language. This is both helpful and unhelpful, in the sense that I never considered writing this book in Russian, just as there were many poems I never thought about writing in English. Most of my prose has been written in English, and both fiction and nonfiction. Specifically in the case of this book, and this began with Waiting for America, I very much felt that the perspective of both the cultural distance and the linguistic distance, the distance of language and culture, was the vantage point that was necessary for me to speak about this, to think about it, to reconstruct these events, and to record them. In fact, I felt that I was correct a couple of years ago when Waiting for America was being translated into Russian, and it's since come out in Moscow. And when I was sent the translation, I really felt that I was very happy I didn't translate it myself or write the book in Russian, because I think it would have been an almost unimaginable experience. Even Leaving Russia was difficult enough in terms of some of the stories I had to reconstruct, although the book is not all doom and gloom. There's love, there's discovery of poetry, there's travel, but nevertheless, I think there's a certain sense of pain that I feel writing in a foreign language or in an adopted second language, if it doesn't alleviate the pain, at least it displaces it into a different language, into a different story. In a way, I always feel that it's my story, but in a way, it's your story as well. And that helped me. Please.
Thank you. Could you tell us something about specifically Jewish culture in Russia? Did you have a shul, synagogue? Were you allowed to do these things in public?
Well, did we have a shul? When I was growing up, there were two synagogues in Moscow. The big choral synagogue and a much smaller Hasidic synagogue. Judaism suffered particularly badly in the 1920s and early 30s during the state campaign against all religions, but disproportionately Judaism and also varieties of Protestant denominations, particularly Baptists, suffered the greatest. When I was growing up, imagine, let's say Moscow had a Jewish population of, let's say, 350,000, and there was one synagogue that was smaller than this space. So even in simple kind of crude terms, even if you think about the religiosity there in terms of the daily communal Judaism here, one could have never accommodated that demand. But of course, it was also dangerous. He was also persecuted. I can tell you that when we became refuseniks and when I started going to synagogue more with my father, more for reasons of spirituality than specifically of praying and davening, the place was rife with secret police agents. Students were photographed, and there were fellow activists from universities who would actually identify you, and then you would run into trouble. So that was very much a part of the kind of public Jewish observance. But there was also a great grassroots underground observance that was growing. Particularly, it began to grow after the Six-Day War, which I remember well because I was born then in 1967, because Soviet Jews all of a sudden woke up, right, with the sense that on the one hand, obviously they could never think of full integration, but also this strange renewed sense of Jewish pride, and the Jewish emigration really began after that. So I do write in the book about some of the underground Jewish activities that I witnessed, if not necessarily participated in. Yeah, but also it varied from family to family. One's sense of Jewish roots was not uniform. I knew people whose parents started the day by stopping by a synagogue in their town. I also knew people whose only sense of Jewishness was based on the nationality in their passport or their, Hebrew-derived or Germanic Yiddish name. There was a real spectrum. I was very fortunate because my father's late grandfather on the Litvak side was a rabbi in a long line of rabbis. He was killed in the Shoah, and even as a 4-year-old, I knew that. You see, but I would never insist on there being a uniform way that Soviet Jews were or were not in their expressions of Judaism. Yeah. Please.
I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between the writing in prose and writing in poetry. It's interesting that you say that you don't write poetry now in English.
It's changed just a little bit. I must say, something has happened just this past year where actually, maybe this book is out of the way, I really don't know. But for the first time, I feel that I've been jotting down things. I've been translating a lot of poetry, but I've somehow, I don't know, I woke up with a different sense of freedom where I feel a little more comfortable violating Anglo-American verse and particularly traditions of prosody. Andrew Sofer, who is here, a poet and a friend, we've discussed this a lot. So something has changed. But up until recently, I had a very strong sense that the poetic expression was through Russian or perhaps through translation, but the prosaic through English. Yeah, but I don't think it's anything. It's anything to write home about. I think it's a fairly common scenario. In fact, I think Joseph Brodsky, who was mentioned earlier today, had a great deal of had a great deal of difficulties with not writing Russian poetry in English as opposed to writing Anglo-American poetry. But at the same time, I think this is how the language grows. I've had fellow writers who read Nabokov's prose and said, look, this is incomprehensible. One doesn't write English this way. But at the same time, the young Updike obviously was intoxicated by it. Yeah.
Maxime, I have a quick question. Recently, I heard you answer strange questions on the radio, and questions that were, if I remember correctly, what Dostoevsky or Tolstoy say today about the politics of Russia. So I'm not going to ask you what you would say as a writer about the politics, because you started answering those questions on NPR a few weeks ago. But my question to you is, how do you feel that writing a memoir, how do you think it helps you or not thinking about politics in general? And do you feel that writing memoirs, for example, keep you away in a certain way from politics? Or do they help you in a certain tradition of writers in France or in Russia? Does it help you in a way, I don't know in what way, but think about current events, for example, and when you have to answer such questions as what Dostoevsky or Tolstoy would say about politics in Russia today, where do you get your insights, your own insights to answer those questions?
Yeah, thank you, Johan. Just to contextualize the question, Johan kindly referred to this exchange that occurred, I think, a week and a half ago on Chris Lydon's show, which was about the current situation in Crimea. Lydon, being an ardent reader and a great admirer of Russian literature, had this idea that he would invite people who were experts in politics and policy, including one who was Reagan's close advisor on Russia, informal, and a couple of emigre cultural historians and authors, and have a conversation. So, of course, as you can imagine, the points of view varied. And one of the questions he posed to Svetlana Boym, my colleague and friend at Harvard, and me was, what would Chekhov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Nabokov have said about the invasion, the intervention, as I call it, the intervention, sort of echoing what was happening during the Russian Civil War after the Bolshevik Revolution. And look, we cannot answer these questions without a measure of speculation, but we tried. Nevertheless, your question is about whether writing a memoir helps, I suppose, sharpen up one's perspective about the present. I am not sure. I know how to answer that question. I think it helped me make sense of the political context and the ideological tensions that surrounded me when I was growing up, in particularly the sense of living a double life of one, a public Soviet youth who adhered to many codes and prescribed behaviors, and a son of refuseniks, increasingly involved in refusnik activism. That, I think, clarified a lot of things to me. I suppose it also helped, Johan, understand that nations stay true to the patterns of their past. In which sense, was I surprised or shocked that Russia annexed Crimea? No, because it had done it before, it had conquered it before, and I think what I was surprised by, not to offend political scientists, is that nobody anticipated it. For instance, I'm very surprised that our national security experts weren't talking about it or hadn't been talking it enough. So in that sense, it's a very indirect answer to your question, but if you have clarity about the pattern of your past, it probably helps you make sense of the pattern of your old country's present, but only partially. There was a question here, yes? Please.
Yes, well, Jews have had Torah to anchor them in exile and diaspora since the fall of the temple, and so there's this text that anchors them to land, to history, tradition, and regardless of where they are, they're never going to new histories, new traditions, new lands, as conceptualize that? Might you conceptualize it perhaps where there have been texts, Russian texts or such things that are indeed your, quote, Torahs to anchor you to Russia? Or how would you frame an eventual memoir where texts do play a role in your life as a writer yourself and as one who studies Russian texts, etc.?
Thank you. That's a fascinating question, also very elegantly put. I think the precise answer to your question about whether or not there's going to be a third part in what to some looks like a trilogy in the making is that I don't know. I do talk about this in a very anticipatory way in the epilogue, as in the fact that I've toyed with the idea and I've been asked whether there would be a book about the years that followed the arrival in the United States when I was an undergraduate at Brown, the culture shock, learning to write in English, studying with the late John Hawkes, who really helped me understand a lot of things about the style of American prose, and probably up to the point of marriage. And I really don't know. I can't say that I'm prepared to write this story, but at the same time, where there is a dilogy, I think perhaps there's room for a trilogy. Now, as far as a dialogue with the texts, of course, I am constantly, as a writer, in dialogue with the writers who have formed me in many ways, made me who I am, or who I was at the time of the leaving, specifically with Chekhov and with Nabokov, very much so. But look, it's one of those things, one is reminded of what Isaac Bashevis Singer used to say about reading Dostoevsky as a young man. He thought Dostoevsky was a Jewish writer. He was convinced because he bought his Yiddish translations in cheap paperbacks with no copyright and no name of translator. And as a young man, he was convinced that this is a Jewish writer, and he must be, because he somehow captures, you know, the incomprehensible duality, multiplicity of the human psyche, these internal contradictions. So, of course, Jews from Eastern Europe made their own the Russian classics, but I don't think they became their Torah. I think they became a little bit of the commentary.
Yes, Professor Schreier, it would be interesting to hear you reflect, if you would, on how your experience as a Soviet Jewish immigrant and then coming to the United States compares to the experience of other immigrants or other immigrant groups. Have you thought about that? And you've mentioned, you know, being an immigrant several times, and I'm just wondering if you've thought about situating yourself or your group, as it were, in the larger picture of American immigration.
I have thought about it, of course. How can one not think about it, and especially living in a place like Boston, and especially if you have kids in public school, as I do in Brookline. I'm not sure I have it in me to answer this question, except intuitively. On the broad surface of it, the huge outflux of Jews, or mostly Jews, because of course there were mixed marriages, but under the aegis of the Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union, was probably the last great identity immigrant group to come to America. I don't believe there's going to be another immigration like that, so concentrated, so cogent in many respects, and also leaving under very similar, under largely the same, agenda. Have I thought about how we Soviet Jewish immigrants differ from other groups? Yes, I've thought about it, particularly through a fictional lens. My book, Yom Kippur in Amsterdam, is largely about what I found very intriguing, that Jews from the Soviet Union have done so well professionally. Think of the Jewish boy from Russia who invented Google, right? And yet, I'm not entirely sure the mainstream here has the sense that it's hard to think of our mainstream, the daily fabric of our lives without Jews from the Soviet Union in it. It's something of a paradox. I think even living in this town, I recently had an experience where a group of high school students from Texas got in touch with me. They were doing a project researching, I was shocked, at a private school in Austin, researching the history of Jewish immigration from Russia and the Soviet Union. And they came to Boston to gather field research. And so they interviewed various people. But I had the sense that they weren't finding a lot of answers by simply asking people around, which suggests to me perhaps that somehow the fabric is not apparent, except through those, exceptional achievers like Elie Reisman, right, the Olympic winner who studied gymnastics here in Newton, or Sergey Brin or Gary Steingart. But on the whole, I think there is something peculiar about the sense of having arrived and not having arrived both together. And I'm not quite sure what to make of it yet. So thank you. That's a very interesting question. Please.
If you were in Russia now, and you, as a Jew, but you had your love of Russia, you can show, how would you feel being in that situation, not immigrating, towards the Russian view towards the Ukraine? As a Jew, with your love of Russia, being in Russia, how would you feel to the Ukraine?
It's an interesting question, perhaps a little tendentious, but I thank you for it. I think I would feel exactly the same as I would feel as a non-Jew living in Russia, or as a person with humanistic commitments and passions. I would feel that this is an act of aggression, blatant and unfair. I think specifically in Jewish terms, it's contrary to what I think are Jewish ideas of justice, and I would be ashamed of it as I am standing before you today. If I, David, may be allowed to read one short passage, it has nothing to do with, well, it has something to do with your question, simply because it's set on the coast of the Black Sea. There's a long chapter in the book, in some ways a centerpiece, which deals with a formative experience, an expedition in which I took part throughout the summer of 1986, my last Soviet summer. And I traveled from Moscow, taking rural roads for 2 months, traveled first to the area of North Caucasus, and this was North Caucasus on the brink of all the ethnic explosions and wars that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. And after that, staying on the area of the Black Sea, Russian Black Sea coast, south of Sochi. Of course, you've all heard of Sochi, where the Olympics took place, but also, of course, the Crimea is not far from there. Little did I know that years later I would also end up writing a book about the Shoah in Crimea and how it was witnessed. But in this particular section, I simply talk about what it was like to experience that double life in the way I related to some of my peers, particularly a certain young woman with whom I became involved, and how the involvement was only possible because we were away from our lives in Moscow, away from the public sphere, in the privacy of this expedition through the Russian heartland. So basically imagine, the context is, this is July 1986. The group of us has just left North Caucasus, and we are arriving on the Russian coast of the Black Sea. After Горячий Ключ, it was straight down to the coast, and then another hour along the maritime highway before we came to Pshada, a small inland town about 25 miles down the coast from the resort of Gelendzhik. During the week we spent at the Black Sea, I didn't make a single diary entry. This gap, and by the way, I should explain, I somehow, my father is a writer, and in our family tradition, diary keeping was associated with travel. So we kept diaries. I was always encouraged to keep diaries when I traveled, but not when I wasn't. So I had this diary, and when I was leaving Moscow on the 7th of June, 1997, I carried it in a little backpack, and the customs officer, who was a young man, probably my age, straight out of customs police school, he said, well, what's that? Because you were searched. I said, it's a diary of my journey. It has some notes for poems. And he said very euphemistically, he said, are you going down south or are you going up north? Meaning, are you going to Israel or to North America? And I didn't want to engage, so I just said, And he said, oh, what the hell, just take the diary. And so I brought it with me. And so some of the sources for this chapter are actually in this diary, which I still have. But basically here I'm saying that I wasn't keeping this journal. This gap owes itself to several circumstances. Even though we still adhered to a schedule of lectures and digs, the Black Sea stop was a time of respite and relaxation, and I must have taken a break from chronicling or note-taking for future poems. The week at the Black Sea was also the culmination of a love adventure with an elusive classmate by the name of Anastasia. It was going absolutely nowhere, we both knew, and had no future in Moscow. Anastasia came from a Soviet diplomatic family, and I surmised, she was reticent, that she had spent part of her childhood in East Germany. Once, Anastasia alluded to having gone with her parents to a nudist beach on the Baltic Sea. I think she surmised, without asking questions, that I was from a refusenik family. Anastasia was smart, prankish, and open-minded. She was almost 6 feet tall, my height, short-haired, slender, and blonde. She looked Scandinavian and sported low-cut summer outfits, braless and backless. Like some other members of Soviet golden youth I had met, Anastasia was sardonically contemptuous of the system. She despised our expedition living, the dirt, the collectivism, acting in every way as though she were an inmate en route to penal servitude. She wore long dresses to supper and stared with horror at rusty red stewed pork or khaki pea soup. Lying out in the sun and smoking was perhaps her greatest pleasure throughout the 2 months of the journey. Sometimes I shared Anastasia's solitude. We would sneak out of the camp into the steppe or a mountain forest, later to a pebbly, deserted beach. Once, both of us exhausted after an all-day ascent to the mountains, we tried to make love in Anastasia's tent, but had to halt after one of her tent mates woke up and cried, "Is someone here?" I crawled out before the roommate had time to reach for a flashlight. Anastasia and I knew that romance together, even under the most discreet of terms, was limited by the duration of the expedition. So more delicious, the adventure, and especially its last 2 weeks, right on the razor's blade of time. And in fact, the razor's blade of time in some ways captures how the book is written, because I think our lives, and particularly the life I tried to record, was one of living on the razor's blade of time. I thank you very much again.